everybody, I'm Mango Thunderslice, and today's video is EMP. Solar Micronova, Galactic Energy, and Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower. Subtitle, The Real Great Reset. And going to be talking about a few different subjects today, returning to the primary theme of the channel, if I were to venture to say that one exists, which is to say the alternative scientific paradigm and how it ties into virtually everything, including the spiritual realm and this whole psychic reality that we inhabit. So yeah, basically, I thought that Ken Wheeler over at Theory Apophysis brought forth some good videos clarifying essentially what everyone is missing who thinks that Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was going to be a failure, and how they truly don't understand even the very basic conception of what it was intending to do. And them in their midwit, pissant mentality will say, oh, it wasn't going to work, right? How many people do you know in your life who basically can say that something doesn't work, or will naysay, or basically just, bitch and moan, but ultimately can create virtually nothing of their own? And of course we have, the old trolls and the new trolls around the channel, midwits who, like to pepper these sorts of comments around. I find them always to be truly entertaining. And so we'll continue with it today. But one thing that Ken clarified was that there's a monumental difference between the Hertzian spectrum and the Tesla spectrum that he was operating on. Essentially, to break this down, is the transverse modality of transverse waves versus longitudinal waves, right? And longitudinal waves are not actually waves. He says it about 1,000 times in the video. Ken is a great guy, and if you're a very smart and technical person, I find that his explanations are very useful, but not everybody is on that sort of level. And whereas he explained the difference in theory between them fairly well, I don't think he really explained the actual functioning of the tower as clearly as he might have. So that's where I'm going to kind of pick up on that and tie it into some of the other videos that I've watched recently from Suspicious Observers and Adapt 2030, really examining the situation that we're entering into within the energetic sphere, the plasma sheath of the sun, and how that ties into the wider plasma sheath of the galaxy, and the electric current sheet that is permeating from each of these nodes, and how they interplay to create this recurring catastrophe cycle that we are likely entering into in our lifetimes, right? It is very likely that if I live even an average lifetime, that I intend to see the magnetic excursion of the planet and potentially a pole flip, which historically entails many aspects of cataclysm, as we know. And even the words catastrophe and disaster, they have in their root, in the core, the word astro, which means star, which I thought was very interesting. I hadn't actually noticed that before. And so the difference, essentially, to return to just the difference between transverse and longitudinal waves, think of a transverse wave as like a sheet of paper, right? Or those ropes that they do at the sort of MMA gyms a lot of times, where it basically, it's casting a wave, but it's not actually extending or shortening the medium. It's basically just moving it up and down. This is the Hertzian spectrum. This is every single aspect of electricity and electrical devices we know in the world today is running on a transverse wave Hertzian system, where the electric and magnetic fields are 90 degrees out of sync, essentially expressing that it is a wave going up and down. But the medium ultimately is unaffected, and there are tremendous losses built into this. Just like if you were to shake a sheet of paper, it's only going to go so far. Each one of those waves has a loss built into it. And you can think of a longitudinal wave. Longitudinal wave is basically the actual medium is elongating and shortening. It is a compression impulse rather than a wave, a pressure impulse. And so you can think of this like a slinky, right? Think of a slinky extended out, right, to the point where it's at a state of natural tension. And basically, if you were to shake this slinky, and it would actually, it's not moving up and down, it's actually just shaking through the medium, the actual compression wave, the compression impulse. And so it will float through the medium, and it basically, there's far fewer losses built into that sort of pressure impulse than there is in the transverse wave. right? If you were to shake the slinky, it would keep going much farther than the transverse wave would on an equivalent, force of impulse from the starting point. And also those metal balls that hang right back and forth, and you drop one and it hits the other one, and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and there's far fewer losses built into that sort of compression impulse wave, or again, it's really an impulse more than a wave. And ultimately there's more losses built into that than when we think of an actual longitudinal impulse within, say, current moving through the ether, right? Of energy moving through space, or energy even moving through the crust of the earth, right? The Schumann resonance, which many people are familiar with, this sort of heartbeat of the earth, this natural pulse, which is normally between 8 and 15 hertz, right, when we define it in that spectrum, but it's really not a wave, it's a compression impulse, and it just moves at a certain rhythmic nature. But ultimately, if we were to tap into that compression wave, it would not have the same losses as we're thinking of wireless energy in the sense of a Wi-Fi modem or a radio tower, etc. Because we're not just shaking the piece of paper, we're actually using that impulse. And what the Wardenclyffe Tower, I think when people hear wireless energy, they think it's moving through the air, right? And even Ken didn't really specify what exactly the functioning of the Wardenclyffe Tower was about. The wireless energy does not imply that it's moving through the air, right? So that doesn't actually make any sense if you were to really extrapolate it. The wireless energy is through the crust of the earth. The earth becomes the conductor. You don't need a wire because you have the grand universal conductor of the planet, which is the earth's crust. And there's a tremendous amount of, mystery still in the composition of the Earth's crust, right? The deepest artificial holes drilled into the Earth find far more actual liquid water than they were expecting. Even conventional science will acknowledge that there is a tremendous amount of water locked in the Earth's crust. They suggest that most of it is locked within mineral forms, but actually there's lots and lots of liquid water in the Earth. And the Earth is, of course, filled with metals of various kinds. It is an absolutely monolithic conductor. And the effectiveness of a conductor is a function of certain variables, not the least of which is the size of the conductor, right? How do you get more power into a building? You get a thicker and better conductor. And the thickness of the crust of the Earth makes it actually a fantastic conductor. The conventional explanation of the Schumann resonance is that it is the pulse of lightning bolts hitting the Earth, right? And even the lightning bolts are a function of energy coming into the planet's atmosphere from the solar electric wind as well as the galactic electric wind. And so from start to finish, it's all this interconnected electric circuit and a bunch of sphere magnets basically arranging themselves in ways that form sort of harmonic frequencies among them. And within the next, near the end of this next presidential presidential reign, right about October 2024, it's projected that the 4 gas giant planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus, will basically line up in a box formation, almost a perfect square, and they'll all be on one side of the sun. And essentially, there's going to be a point where these 4 planets will experience magnetic connection and form a giant electromagnetic torus amongst them. And of course, the sun has its primary electromagnetic torus that sort of is the center of gravity electrically or energetically speaking for the solar system. And the Earth will be caught between these 2 toroids of energy. And so this, is going to put strain on the planet. And at least what Adapt 2030 was going into was the whole mud flood. There's a lot of information on the internet about mud flood. A lot of it is from the flat earth crowd. And so I never really paid too much attention to it. It's fascinating material, but when people are using it kind of in the context, the greater context of a flat earth theory, I just kind of, take it with a massive grain of salt, because, it's just information devoid of the proper context is useless ultimately. But to think of a mud flood as a recurring aspect of the catastrophe cycle as a result of electromagnetic strain placed on the Earth where maybe it is pulled into sort of an ellipsoid form more than a spherical form. And of course, it's not a perfect sphere normally. But when it's pulled between two electromagnetic toroids, whereas normally it's just the sun holding everything in a center of gravity and balance, then all of a sudden we will be faced, 4 years from now, just about, between this, these two toroids, and the Earth will be placed under strain. And of course, as we were just mentioning, there's lots of water within the Earth, and there's already minor mud floods that happen, all over the place, and they'll go and basically just, like sweep buildings away and bury 1-2 floors in mud. And we see evidence all over the world of these, old buildings that seemed to be very ornate when we excavate them, and they appeared to be buried under mud, and to the point where it couldn't actually be excavated. It was almost like the entire city, and cities all over the world got covered in mud, essentially up to, at least 1 or 2 floors of their buildings. And so rather than excavate, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of tons of earth, they basically just built on top of it. They just put in a new floor. Their second floor became the first floor, the third became the second, etc., etc. And, it's very interesting to consider the catastrophe cycle in the context of the EMP, of the electromagnetic pulse, of these energy pulses that come out of the sun, that come out of the galaxy. There's a natural rhythmic part of it that happens all the time from just the current sheet, right? It's this rippling, field of energy around the equator of the sun and the galaxy, but it moves out in a sort of spiral. And so there's this rhythmic interchange and interplay between the bodies that move through that field. And what essentially our entire electric world is based on the transverse wave. It's based off of these very ultimately weak systems that are very easy to sort of burst and overload in states of electromagnetic stress. And so even when we get a solar flare, right, it'll interrupt radio transmission, it'll interrupt networks, powerful flares or coronal mass ejections, influxes of energy will, actually cause old transformers to explode. And if in a real, cataclysmic event, a real energetic emission, an influx into the planet, it doesn't even matter how old the transformer is. Basically, if it's near capacity and it's hit with that extra load, it's just going to blow up. It's going to catch on fire. And, 150, 60 years ago, right, we had the Carrington event, which was nowhere near a catastrophe level event, but it's the biggest thing in recent history, recent as in the last few hundred years, that we can recall of a massive solar flare. And even then, we just had telegraph wires, right, the beginning of the transverse wave technology and the Hertzian spectrum modality. And it burst the telegraph wires, right? They caught on fire. And imagine that sort of event, again, just a Carrington level event happening in this current world of complete digitization, everything's electronic. This car is electronic. Everything is like going to be wiped out in the event of a real catastrophe level solar or galactic emission that comes into the planet. And the thing is, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Right? There is a 12,000 year cycle, and there's half cycles of 6,000 years. It's interesting to think that these numbers align more or less with the ending of the last ice age, as well as what, in Christian eschatology and most of the Abrahamic faiths consider to be the age of the world, right? Of 6,000 years. And basically, what if that's saying not that the planet is 6,000 years old, but that the world is 6,000 years old, in that everything that we know and everything in this world of mankind interplaying with the world is 6,000 years old, right? Ultimately, that is the real definition of the word world, as distinct from the planet, right? The planet was not created 6,000 years ago, but there's a fair case to be made, given that, linguistic context, that the world was created 6,000 years ago, because that was the time of the last great cataclysm. And monotheism, sprang up from that, basically interpreting those cataclysmic events through the lens of a angry God that was responding to the sins of the world. And again, I believe in God. I believe that, ultimately there's only one singular point to the entire universe seen through a dimensional frame, and that is a conscious, singularity, and ultimately, so that's a monotheistic God. Ultimately, again, I'm an omonistic, Gnostic, Druidic Christian, so there's many subdomains, right, of the angels and the spirits and all the different things that govern this world beyond the physical. And I believe in all those too, but they're still all subdomains of the one true God. And ultimately, it's not so much about interpreting things all literal to me, but extracting the value and understanding that there is a purpose in living a moral existence, because otherwise we have a society that is not just easy to collapse under peaceful circumstances, but a society that will utterly and totally collapse when it is subjected to any amount of strain, right? You know not when the owner of the vineyard will return. So always be watching is what Jesus said. And you will know by certain, time, the wars and rumors of wars. And when you see basically the leaves on the fig tree, you will know that summer is coming. And, basically there are signs that can tell when we are getting close to that. Looking through the scientific realm outside of the, Einsteinian materialist delusions, we can see that basically these are recurring cycles, and that we are actually due right now, within the next, right now as in geologic time, within the next few decades, for another magnetic excursion, and potentially solar micronova and catastrophe cycle event. And this isn't something that just happens on one day and then is over. It's something that actually is a period of years, if not decades, potentially even centuries if we're talking about moving through a galactic current sheet. And so, again, the more that I think about it, it really doesn't actually matter what happens with the next presidential administration or whatever they're planning as far as a great reset, because if you understand how weak and incompetent the deep state is, and Biden and Harris at this point, in this current year in 2020 and all the rest, the idea of thinking of that weakness in the context of the sheer power of an energetic transmission such as we are contemplating, a solar micronova at a certain point, it is ultimately, I'm going to look at the bigger wave. I'm not going to look at the little wave, because that's ultimately what concerns me, is what is the greatest threat. It's a matter of triage. And so, ultimately they can try for whatever socialism they want, and at a certain point the top echelon of these people, they know about this, but ultimately what do incompetent people do with large information, right? What does a dog do with an electrical engineering textbook? It turns it into a chew toy, right? Dogs are smart in their own sense, but they're dumb and stupid when it comes to the ability to engineer electrical devices. So it's better used as a chew toy. And that's essentially where we're at with the deep state and the knowledge of this catastrophe cycle, right? These people aren't elite. They are morons, right? Being clever, they are clever. I'll give them that much. They are devious, and they will do anything to hold on to their power. But ultimately, they're extremely stupid when it comes to intelligence and wisdom. So let us focus on intelligence and wisdom and the actual spiritual underpinning values that are most important in a time of great crisis, because that is what will hold us together. And that is not something that any politician, Trump or Rand Paul or anyone else included, can give us. It is ultimately something only that we can give ourselves. And so again, it is so much more useful for us to be focused on the actual construction of this new alternate timeline, the timeline that should have been the main timeline, and we had a chance maybe 150 years ago, but ultimately it was taken from us by devious minds. And perhaps that was part of our destiny to learn this lesson of this final aspect of the age. But now that age is done and gone, and that is what the Bethlehem star reappearing in the sky on the solstice last week, 1 week ago, signified. And it's funny again that Jupiter and Saturn, two of the four gas giants that will align in the box formation 4 years from now, are almost telling us, get ready, my brethren, because times of chaos are coming like we have never seen in modern history. Not in the last 2,000 years have we seen anything like what is coming. And so again, if they want to, unleash the fire hose of credit, and they want to run up the national debt, and they want to do all these things and try and go for socialism, who cares at a certain point? Because at a certain point, the great reset that will actually happen is not from Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and all these dumb old commies trying to implement their, green socialism. It's going to come from the sun and the galaxy and from within this planet. And it will be up to us to rebuild society at that point. It will be up to us to survive in the absence of our electronic gadgets and to essentially reestablish all those fundamental axiomatic principles, both on a moral, philosophical, spiritual, as well as scientific and engineering basis, and to build a new world with a new set of technology, potentially anticipating these energetic influxes on an ongoing basis, and not saying, oh, well, now it's gone. Now we can just build everything on a transverse Hertzian circuit and pretend like it's all going to be good now. Perhaps not. Perhaps we'll have to build an entirely new system on the Tesla spectrum, and using a technology of energetic transmission that does not rely on these inefficient transformers, these inefficient wires transmitting energy with all of these losses built into the system. What Tesla was attempting to do, and why he saw basically, not just Einstein, but the vast majority of his, electrical competitors as kind of incompetent, rightfully so, is because to use the system of longitudinal pressure impulses is always going to be exponentially orders of magnitude more efficient if you can engineer it, which he was going to do. And people say, oh, well, the Wardenclyffe Tower was using fossil fuel energy. And no, it's impossible to do wireless energy because there's losses. Again, they're thinking that the main source of energy was from the fossil fuels, and they're thinking that basically it's a Hertzian system using energy transmission through the air. It was not. The fossil fuel energy was the only activation energy that he ultimately had access to at that particular, time and location in order to get the, prime the pump. But ultimately, once the pump is primed, the water can keep flowing of its own accord. You don't need to keep priming the pump once it's already flowing. This is a very good analogy for what he was trying to do with Wardenclyffe, and basically inducing a constructive interference pattern of pressure impulses into the Earth's crust itself as the prime conductor to create to again prime the pump, to turn the energy system of the Earth that is endemic and natural into something usable and engineerable, to the point where it would be emitting a surplus, and thus anyone on the planet could tap into not power lines but to the Earth's crust, and thus derive that surplus longitudinal power impulse into an engineering device, right? And of course, this is entirely separate from all the devices that we know of today. You can't just plug in an iPad to the ground and expect it to charge with this system. It's basically, it would entail a complete re-engineering of the entire electrical circuit. And it would, as Ken points out, it's not cycles per second, but volts per second. And, it absolutely would have worked. Again, Tesla, and expounded upon by, Steinmetz and et al. Would, basically go on to develop the motors and whatnot. But Tesla, in terms of electrical theory and original electrical engineering, he had it nailed. And it's up to us to basically pick up that alternate timeline, right? A new steampunk world of airships and longitudinal energy transmission, and as well as the accompanying receiver devices and engineerable forms of all the forms of mechanical work that we know of today, the engine and the transistor and the resistor and all these things. We can re-engineer all of it. It just takes a belief in the natural circuit and system of the universe and of the planet and sun and galaxy. Stop being such a pissant little denier, to use a funny term that's always levied against us, and to actually see the interconnected nature of all these energy systems. Stop believing in man, believe in God, believe in the systems of nature that God created, because ultimately that is what will outlive all of us. That is what existed before all of us. And if we could just tap into it, we would see that basically, our civilization would become almost a kingdom of heaven. It would become a world where everyone could prosper. We could unite the nations, and share the valuable aspects among them to lift ourselves into, a Type 1 spacefaring, civilization, and expand throughout the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. But this is essentially what we're looking at, should we choose to accept it. It's a very exciting timeline, as opposed to what they're offering us, which is, you will own nothing and you will like it. Klaus Schwab. Santa Claus will give you everything and take everything in return, right? You know, and ultimately, even if there is a mud flood, again, if we can build a civilization that doesn't even rely on land transport or sea transport as a prime modality, but air transport, of the airship revived in a context of limitless energy, I mean, this, I think, is really at our fingertips. Again, if we should choose to accept it and have the faith to move forward into that world, stop being so afraid and chained to the delusions and conventions of the past, right? All the midwits who claim to be the greatest minds of our civilization, demeaning and bemoaning anyone who dares to question it and think in an alternate manner, right? But ultimately, again, remember Nikola Tesla, and remember that all of the minds who came after him, with the exception of those who built directly on his work, are completely, ultimately, have dog turds for brains. And here we are with basically, you know, the British crown system telling us that we need to lock down and impose totalitarianism in order to fight a virus that has a death rate literally comparable or less than the average, you know, flu. And if you look at the excess death rate, we're literally at less deaths normally, like, versus previous years, and yet they're saying it's the end of the world and we need to lock everything down. Stupidest thing in the world. Again, mediocre minds telling us that they're geniuses, but you know better, I know better, and we will proceed forth in faith into the future. Peace.